Howdy. Recently I reached out to Rosie Brain Embroidery about doing a collaborative animation piece. Embroidery is a time-consuming and materials-heavy process, so I wanted to design an animation that would have a minimal number of frames while not compromising on smoothness of motion, which is why I opted to make a weaving animation loop. Weaving loop animations have elements that animate from one start point to an end point that is the start point of another section of the animation, having multiple sections of the longer animation visible at any given time. Here are some animations that I've made that incorporate weaving loops. You can see how the elements animate from one stage of the animation into the start of the next stage of the animation. It's a bit like an assembly line. The first section of the animation starts and it makes the frame of the car. Then it hands it off to the next section of the animation where the wheels are put on. And then the next section where the doors are put on. And then the next section of the animation where the front and the back. And then the final section where the engine goes on. Except, like an assembly line, everything's happening, each section is happening simultaneously. So instead of taking the full time of all the components added together, you're having each component happen simultaneously, which makes for a much shorter assembly time or animation loop time. Look at this basic loop of a circle moving from left to right. It takes 4 seconds. It's over the course of 48 frames. The circle comes from outside the shot, into the shot, and then out of the shot. It's smooth enough animation, but it takes a long time and a lot of individual stills to create that sense of motion. Let's break this into half the length. So here you have the first section of animation, which is taking the circle and animating it over the course of 24 frames, taking the circle and it's going from point 0 to point 5, going halfway, and then it starts over again. And then you have this second half of the animation where it's going from halfway into the animation to the final position. So if you're looking at these individually, it doesn't look like a smooth motion, but if you combine them together, now you have 2 circles that are going half the distance simultaneously, and you have that same sense of motion of the circle moving directly across the shot, but it's accomplished in half the time. It's effectively the same motion as 48 frames, but it's happening over a course of only 24 frames. Now let's divide that 48 frame loop into 4 pieces. Each of these sections is now 12 frames long, and the distance that's being covered by each is a quarter of the full loop. Let's combine these. Now you have 4 circles at any given time within the shot, but the motion is still the same. It's going from one side to the other, and it's sort of handing off at each section as it's going along. But instead of it being the 48 frame full length time period, this is happening over only a course of 12 frames now. We can still go shorter with this loop. Let's make it 8 pieces. Now you start to run into some issues that sometimes crop up with this process. If the animation that's taking place is too tight in proximity to the previous motion, you might have some elements of overlapping. This may be part of what you want to include into a weaving loop animation. Maybe it's something you want to avoid. At the very least, it's something to consider if you're interested in pursuing this. Because this is the 48 frame loop divided into 8 separate sections, now this is only 6 frames long. The motion, the speed, the smoothness is all the same, but it's 1/8 of the length of the initial animation. I'm going to go one more step with this animation and divide it into 16 individual parts, which means that each section is only 3 seconds long. Each loop is only 3 seconds. You start to get into a more abstract state with this sort of animation where it's just a bunch of circles stacked and it looks more like a congruous form that's taking the thing. But if you were to follow one single circle and go the full length of the distance traveled, you will see that it is running at the same speed as it did in the initial animation. Now that we've broken down a simple abstract loop, let's look at what I made for Rosie Brain Embroidery. I wanted to make an animation for Rosie that reflected more of some of the motifs that she works with, which tends to be a lot of floral and plant matter. I saw a design that she had that had a vine going between flowers with circular petals. The vine had repeating leaves, which are good for the weaving loop animation, and the flowers had radial symmetry, which is another thing that's good for creating a loop. Here's the animation that I came up with. the leaves move along the vine and the flowers rotate in circles. Petals get larger and smaller as they rotate around the center of the flower. The time it takes for the pair of leaves to enter into frame, go the full distance along the vine, and exit is 54 frames. The total time that it takes for a flower to rotate, make one full rotation, is 36 frames, but this animation, as it's presented, is only 6 frames long. I made this animation in After Effects. Let's get into it. Here I have After Effects open, and first I'll make a new composition by clicking this button here, and I'm going to name this Flower Vine. I'm going to make the width 1920 and the height 1080. I'm going to make the frame rate set to 12 FPS. And for the duration, because the overall length that I'm aiming for is 54 frames, I'm going to make it a little bit longer by making this be 5 seconds long. And this will be, background will be white. Come on. So now I have a blank canvas. I'm going to select the pen tool up here in the toolbar. I can also hit G as a shortcut and then come to fill and make it so the fill is white and the stroke is black and the stroke width is 20 pixels. And then I'm going to draw the center of the vine. And I'm not going to be animating this, so I'm just going to go ahead and lock that layer. Next, I'm going to draw a leaf, and the leaf I'm going to have a thinner stroke, so I'm going to make this just 5 pixels wide. And if I click in the composition, I'll have a new shape layer, and there we have a leaf. Next thing that I'm going to do is start animating. So I'm going to come down to Contents, go to Shape, Path, and click this little button here, and that'll add a keyframe at its current state. I'm going to drag this out and then go to the last frame of the loop, which is frame 54, or if you're looking at the time code here, it'll be 4 seconds and 6 frames. And then I'm going to drag the leaf to its final destination and shorten my playback to be the same length, which means that if I hit play, the leaf moves slowly in a direct straight line from point A to point B. And so I'm going to adjust this along the way. Anytime that you move the leaf, it will create a new keyframe for the path. And so I'm just gonna come along here and give it some main points to where I want it to fall as it's moving along. And see how this goes. It gets a little tight here, so let's move this up, and I'm actually going to give this a little bit of a twist as it's going around here. I'll make it so it has something over here as well. And then it's got its own sort of like weird wiggle. It's the sort of thing that I would refine if I were doing this for a final something or other. Goes kind of slow on the front end. And let's just make it a little bit further down here. And now we have what would be essentially one long loop because it's cutting into the scene and out of the scene. But what I want is a bunch of iterations of this. And to do that, you could copy and paste this layer a bunch of times, which I've done in the past, and adjust the position of the animation within that, or you can add an echo effect. And to do that, you're gonna come up to this menu up here, go to Effect, go down to Time, and go to Echo. We want a loop, a weaving loop animation that's 6 frames long. Our frame rate is 12 frames, so 6 frames is half a second. So I'm gonna go to echo time and make this -0.5, -half of a second, because we want it to land before. Now for number of echoes, it's not super specific because this animation has them cropped on either side, so it's okay if you have too many or too, well, it's okay if you have too many. If you have too few, it'll be noticeable, but I'll make it 10. And then starting intensity and decay I'm not going to bother with, and I'm going to do composite in front. And now, if you watch playback, you'll see that the leaf multiplies. And if you focus in on the last 6 frames by going to frame to 4 seconds in and selecting the play area to just be these last 6 frames, you get a loop. You get a looping function where it all animates from one point into the next point, and that next point is the start point of the next section of the animation. You get a seamless looking loop. Now I'm going to add a second leaf by coming back to frame number 1 and getting my pen tool and drawing my little leaf, and coming down to shape 2 over here, going down to path and adding a keyframe, moving this guy out of frame here, come to the last frame, frame 54, dragging the frame over there. And because we already applied the echo effect, you'll see that it's doubling, well, not doubling, it's multiplying. And so I'm going to come to like some major points in the animation, adjust the position of it, come here, adjust the position so it's right about there. Come here, add another keyframe by just sort of dragging stuff along. It cuts into stuff here, so I'm going to drag it down here. And now we have 2 sets of leaves. I'm going to pull this down a little bit. And if we crop the play area to be just the last 6 frames, you got a loop going. And now, to make this full composition only be 6 frames, I'm going to, for ease of me, for my own ease, I'm going to select the layer that I want to crop down time-wise, select it, do Command left bracket, and that'll make it so it makes the first frame be where the current playhead location is. I'm going to drag this to the front end, and I'm going to hit Command K to make an adjustment to the composition settings, and from 5 seconds I'm going to change this to be just 6 frames long. And now this is a full composition, and it's pretty much ready to export. If you wanted to make adjustments, that's fine. I'm not saying the animation is 100%, but the concept's there, and you can build on this if you wanted to do something similar. And I would like to build on it by adding some flowers. So before we get to exporting, I'm going to make some flowers. So I'm going to come back to my project over here, create a new composition, name this flower clockwise. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller because it's not taking up the whole frame, just a section in the corner. So I'm going to make this 600 pixels by 600 pixels, 12 frames. The flower that I'm designing has 6 petals, which means that to make a seamless loop rotation, we need to rotate it from one petal to the next, which there are 6 of, so it needs to rotate 1/6 of rotation for a full animation. Because I'm designing this the way that I am, we need to actually do a full rotation and then go from there. So we want 1/6 of the rotation to be equal to the length of the other loop animation, which is 6 frames. So 1/6 will be 6 frames. So if we're making one full rotation, it's going to be 6 times 6 frames, or 36 frames. I want a little bit of buffer on either side, so I'm going to make this composition be 4 seconds long, because 36 frames with 12 frames per second is 3 seconds. So I've got flower clockwise, and now we have a blank composition. Next thing that I'm going to do is add an ellipsis to the scene, or a circle, but it's the ellipsis tool. So you might have it defaulting for you to being the rectangle tool. So if that's the case for you, you can do long click and it'll have this menu pop up and come to ellipsis tool. And then I'm just going to draw one onto the scene. We still have the same stroke and fill as what we had before. And I am now going to center this ellipse. This is just going to be the center of the flower. So I'm going to come to the contents, go down to ellipse 1 and go to transform, and you can see that the position is not center, but change the position to 0, 0, and now this ellipse is in the center. I'm not going to animate this one, so I'm not going to lock it yet. I'm going to use this as a reference for the petals. So I'm going to copy this, Command C, Command V. Now I'm going to lock this one and adjust the... I'm going to be using both the shape transform attributes and the layer transform attributes. So I'm first going to come into transform and adjust the anchor point on the y-axis so that it's positioned above the flower center. And now I'm going to come to rotation and click keyframe, and then go to the total length of the loop that I want is 3 seconds. So I'm going to come to 3 seconds in the timeline and change the variable in front of x, meaning number of times rotated, and change it to 1. And change this playback distance. So now we have just a smooth rotation, and it rotates around the center point because I adjusted the anchor point before changing the rotation, where if I had the anchor point at 0, the circle would just be rotating in place and you wouldn't actually see anything because it's symmetrical at that point. So the next thing that I'm going to do is make it so the flower is getting larger and smaller. I want that to take 1/3 of the total loop, which is 12 frames. So I'm going to come to the content section, go down to ellipse, click that open, and click the transform ellipse, and move back to the first frame in the animation, take the scale and move it down. Let's make it so it's, let's just make it 50. That's an easy percentage. And click to add a keyframe. And our loop is going to be 12 frames, which means if we're getting larger and smaller at the smallest size, that'll be at every multiple of 12 or every second. And half of that time is 6 frames. So I'm going to come to frame number 6 and increase the size. I'll just make it 100. That's easy. And I want this to end up in the same spot. So I'm going to just copy these 2 keyframes, move to frame 12 or 1 second in the timeline. I copy these keyframes by selecting them both and pressing Command C. Now I'm going to hit Command V, and this is the basic motion that's happening there, but I need to also apply the scale shift at frame 24 and then again at frame 36. And now we have and it's a seamless loop. Finally, we're going to add the echo effect. It's going to be almost the same as what we had before. If you click Effect, because echo was the last effect that we used, it should just be there by default. We want the same offset in time because we want an offset of 6 frames. So I'm going to do Command 0.5 because that's half of a second and 1 second is 12 frames. The main thing that's a little bit different here is for the number of echoes, we need it to be the specific number we're working with so that we don't have extra shapes when we get to the final bit, because this is animating back to an origin point and not out of the scene. We need 6 of these, which means that we need 5 echoes. And I'm going to change this to composite in front. And similarly to the leaves, if you play it from the starting point, you'll have the elements come out, but we just want the loop, so we're going to look at this as the last 6 frames. And there we have a seamless loop and a rotation. That's only 6 frames long, but if you were to follow a single circle, you would follow it for 36 frames. I would like to have 2 iterations of this flower. I want one that's spinning clockwise and one that's spinning counterclockwise, which is why I named the flower clockwise initially. So I'm going to come back to my project window, copy this composition, paste it, and now I have a duplicate version of this animation. I want it to be counterclockwise, so let me indicate that in the composition settings so that I know which one's which. Command K will bring up the composition settings, and I'm going to change the composition name. And it's still rotating the way that it was before because I haven't changed any of the variables and stuff. So I'm going to come down to transform and go to the rotation keyframe that I had before as 1, and I'm just going to make this -1. And now, oop, I moved outside of the playhead, or the play area. So now it's rotating in the opposite direction. To prep this for the importing into the full composition, I'm going to similarly crop it down to the first frame, drag it over here, change the composition settings to be only 6 frames long. And then I'll do the same for the original flower. Drag it over here, Command K, adjust the duration to be 6 frames long. And we have 2 looping flowers going in opposite directions. Gonna click back over to the flower vine and drag the clockwise guy over here. And scale it down a little bit so that it fits over here. Let's move it over because it's cropping out. A little smaller. And then drag the counterclockwise over here, make it a little smaller. And there you go. This is a 6-frame animation that combines 2 much longer animations, one being 54 frames, the other being 36 for a total loop of animation. And instead of having something much longer, you have something much smaller and more effective for filling out a space and using fewer frames. A weaving loop animation. And if I were to export this, I would probably export it as JPEGs just because I would be using this for reference stuff. Here is the final embroidery by Rosie. It's 6 frames long, and here's the front. Very nice. And here's the back, so you can see process, which I'm big into. If you want to see more work by Rosie, you can check out her Instagram at rosiebrain.embroidery, or you can go to her website, rosiebrain.com, where she has a shop and available embroideries for you to purchase. She's based in the UK. Weaving loops have different applications. Maybe your situation is like mine and you have a really labor-intensive process, or maybe you want to cut back on material uses, or you have a format that restricts the amount of space that you have available. Maybe you want to fill out a scene quickly by animating one element and then repeating it multiple times. Maybe you like the aesthetic and that's it. Like any technique, there are practical applications, impractical applications, good use, bad use, easier and more difficult uses of the same technique, just depending on what you're working with. Mess around with it and learn from it. In part 2 of this series, part 2 of weaving loops, I'll talk more about creating weaving loops with hand-drawn animations using like tracing paper and stuff. Like and subscribe if you want to see more of this stuff. Try to stream Mondays through Thursdays from 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 5 to 7. Really varies. You can watch old streams, including the streams that I made the design for Rosie's animation and the live section of my YouTube channel. If you like the music in the background of this video, I made it. You can listen to it on your preferred streaming platform if you just search for Trace Loops. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can do so by going to patreon.com/traceloops, where you will find high-res art files, any and all music that I've made available for download. And at the highest tier, you get a monthly piece of art in the mail from me. Thanks for watching. Have any questions? Throw them in the comments. I'll try to answer any questions. And thanks for watching. Adios.